Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Two Existential Dudes podcast. We took a break last week, but we are now back for our 5th episode.
Yes. Yes, today is going... kind of caught me off guard there. We took an extra week off there because we wanted to do some in-depth study of the topic for today. Specifically, both of us reread a book that we found extremely influential, as you will hopefully see through the...
contents of this podcast. The book by Neil Postman is entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death, subtitled Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. And what would you say he was trying to accomplish in this?
So effectively, to summarize a very detailed book in a couple sentences, Postman is arguing that we have shifted from an age of the written word and the written and spoken word entirely, and thus argument and logical context and discourse, to a era of show business, television, short immediacy, and media that is no longer coherent, nor is it helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And he strongly argues against the trivialization of information and why that's a danger.
That leads really well into the sort of second part of our title here, Media and Epistemology. I would not have known before reading this book what the definition, and even he does a good job of explaining this, but even that's hard to comprehend. So the definition I sort of came up with, and you can check me on this, is the theory of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity, and scope.
Is that the one he wrote?
Actually...
I think that's the one he wrote.
Is that the one he wrote?
I was just looking for it. It is, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, then that's the one he came up with, sorry.
Don't worry.
And, here's my sort of translation of that. How knowledge and truth is discovered and presented. Would you say that's an accurate...
It's definitely accurate. I think best understood to help me kind of grasp this very abstract context where the dictionary definitions were just loopholes within themselves. I found it to be this kind of how does our society and what we think influence how we define intellect? As in, does book learning define intellect? Does trivial facts define intellect? Does skill define intellect? And each of these, or even does oratory define intellect? Each of these he really covers within the book.
You're jumping chapters on me.
I know.
I have that written down.
I know.
For those of you listening, we each have extensive notes in front of us.
You can't hear it, but the paper's just furled.
I myself have about 14 pages of notes that I wrote down, about 1.5 per chapter. So the way this will kind of go is we will cover each chapter individually, and on the way we'll take tangents as we see fit.
Yeah. And then likely can connect it all together towards the end,
absolutely.
if not in the middle somewhere unintentionally.
Absolutely. So the first chapter talks a lot about how the medium through which information is presented has a very big impact on the message, even if that's not the person's intention. The medium through which they communicate information can distort in one way or another the actual substance.
Definitely. Yeah, Postman defines or starts the chapter with the title, "The Medium is the Metaphor." Medium here meaning something that information is passing through or being stored by, such as a book, television, radio, telegrams I think he uses as well.
Mm-hmm.
And metaphor is a little more complicated in the way that he defines it. Other textbooks have referred to it as what is the meaning? Yeah. Some other resources refer to it as the medium is the meaning, which he argues in a different way, into a different nuance. Here meaning that the medium is the metaphor, in that metaphor is the societal effect of that medium on the information it passes. Not saying that the television itself is the information, but the information that passes through the television is fundamentally altered by that because of the way it's designed.
It almost acts as a filter that you view that information through. One important thing before we delve into the specific mediums and which ones are better for different things, it's important to recognize that when you're viewing information through these mediums, especially the more modern ones, it becomes based on who the most successful people become, the people who are most skilled in using the medium rather than the people with the best information.
Numerous times throughout the book, he argues that the best people in show business are not those who are the best at their craft, but the best at presenting it. A great example he uses repeatedly throughout the novel is that the so-called televangelists, or television preachers, these people that you are kind of a trope to some people, in that they appear on television and often present these very bombastic religious services as if they were an actor on television. And he argues for the majority of the book that it is an actor on television. And we'll talk about it later, as there is a whole chapter devoted to this. But effectively, he's saying that the medium of television itself is affecting how these people operate and what they do. And the reason they're so effective, the reason these televangelists are more effective on television than the Pope broadcasting his services, is because of the way they present it and how they apply themselves to the television, not necessarily as the best in their craft, such as the Pope may be to some people, but as the best amusers.
And a few other examples, some of which he uses less frequently, are presidential debates, and certainly that's become more obvious in recent decades, and we'll certainly touch on that. Courtrooms, which I can't remember exactly what he said, but I wrote it down, so it must have been important.
Well, first of all, from what I recall, how he elaborates on the courtrooms is that in a courtroom setting, for most of human history that we've had law situations, we've relied on written law and reciting of the law, specifically of written records, to define how we operate as a society. For example, while Jesus used parables and things to tell stories, if a juror was to stand up and start reciting "kill two birds with one stone," they'd probably be laughed at, if not dismissed, by the judge. And this is to say that the way the medium that they're presenting it through, either oratory, that is speaking, written word, which can function also as oratory, or television or telegraph to some degree, is changing how that comes across. And in different scenarios, it's required to be a different thing.
Thank you for sort of saving me there.
You're welcome.
And I've certainly noticed this, to draw on some of my own experiences. I've recently applied to become a lector at my church, which would basically be reading some of
the word and the gospel.
Yeah.
Such.
And even in those classes I took, they talk about how I must present myself in a certain way and speak, like, because you are essentially communicating the word of God. So there's certainly something there that you can't just achieve by sort of having a casual tone. Or
certainly, yeah. The environment itself limits what you should do, in the same way that courtroom, you don't get up there and act goofy, you get up there and act with reserved clarity, or at least you should usually.
Yeah.
Same thing with political houses. You want to have that reserved clarity to yourself to demonstrate intelligence and guidance and an ability to be an intellectual, to say the least.
And this is the idea really of decorum, where you act in a way that your audience would want you to act, that would be the most effective for getting your message across.
And the way Postman describes this as he describes it as the form excludes the content. And throughout the book, the best way he does a lot of this is through examples, so I'm sure there'll be many more, but to start one today, he uses the example of a smoke signal. Smoke signals may be used to transverse yes, no's, simple information, perhaps like about when to meet or when there's going to be a hunt, hence why they're used by typically pre-civilized civilizations. And then he moves on to suggest that there's a reason why poetry was never put through smoke signals, nor was academic research put through smoke signals, because the medium itself prevents that.
Yeah. And this is where I'd go back to, I guess, really this podcast. Like, I'd say this is a very good medium for discussing the ideas we seek to talk about. And
because yes, to some degree, a podcast may function as entertainment, and I guess does it fall into that category? Is it education at that point? Well, there you go. Exactly that. It can be a little bit of both, and in some ways, it is the question of, do you like our voices? Are they entertaining to you? But then on the other side, is the content entertaining to you, or at least interesting to you? Because spoken words are very rarely entertaining as they are educational. And if they are entertaining, they're entertaining because they're educational. There's a reason why the best rhetoricians tell lots of stories, because one, it gives them a lot of authority, they have wisdom, and two, it demonstrates that they have this air of knowledge and they know about these different things. The sentence kind of fell apart as I went through it. I'm sorry.
It's been happening to me this whole time. Another thing I have on here is, and this is kind of relevant, which would be the idea of digital presentation versus in-person presentation, especially as it, and we'll get more into this, but especially as it pertains to religious services and education.
Yes. And how the way it's presented affects it. And yes, we'll definitely get into that with the education stuff, which I may or may not have read briefly before this podcast. Let's just say to refresh myself. We'll go with that. But the whole point of the medium is the metaphor is that the medium is affecting what's going through it. Like a prism with light, it's changing how we see it.
Another example, if I'm not mistaken, you read this. You read upon rereading the book, you read it in a way you would normally read a book, correct?
Yes, I read it the second time.
So, upon my rereading it, I utilized an audiobook.
We're not sponsored.
This is not sponsored by Audible. Dang it, that's another part of the...
Dang it, no it is!
But I would presume that the way we interpreted it was somewhat influenced by that.
Absolutely. I obviously can't attest to what your experience was, because I'm, last I checked, not you, although we're freakily similar, which is kind of frightening. But in my rereading of it, I found it to be a very, not academic experience, but a very reflective experience, and especially the second time reading it, in between that, I have learned a lot more of United States history and a lot of history in general and a lot of that, and specifically much more rhetoric. And seeing that within this book, particularly the way he uses examples, has, I feel, honestly reinforced that and his argument as it compared to as it was before.
When I was rereading this, it really sort of dawned on me how ill-prepared I really am because of the culture we live in with television and social media and immediacy, and how our critical thinking skills really aren't trained. And even as a person who would generally be considered intelligent, I still had a lot of trouble really making tangible arguments and analyzing this book.
Certainly, any paragraph that was more than 8 or 9 sentences, I struggled to get through. And I'm typically a pretty attentive reader, so I'll be honest, I was very surprised by then. I had to force myself to go even slower to read through it, which we talked about one of these episodes about. I think it was Goals episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would definitely agree that it made me feel very unprepared. I was like, wow, I don't know very much, and my society has shown to me that this isn't relevant anymore.
Yeah.
Effectively is what this book argues, or is arguing that society is arguing.
I think this is a good segue to talk about the ideas of typography and how that was such a robust medium for discussing these type of issues.
So typography, for those of you who might not know, it's a very simple concept. It's just the act of writing, and specifically the act of printed writing using the printing press, which he refers to as a marker point for the beginning of the typographic age, which was then ended by the immersion of television and to some degree radio and the telegraph. And he uses as his principal example, he uses the writing of the Enlightenment period. And it's very clear why, as the Enlightenment was all about argument and having 2 points. You can see this in art, art, music, writing, and the way they speak, law. The United States Constitution was founded on principles of Enlightenment to some degree, and it was written by Enlightenment men. So one of the points he brings up is Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was not a radio broadcast, was not typically a spoken thing, but a written pamphlet.
Mm-hmm.
That was the bestseller. And a statistic he uses to really compare it, which I found really impressive, the sales per percentage of people who bought it, and like percentage of people in the United States, for a novel to do that well, it would have to have the publicity of the Super Bowl and sell to all of those people.
That is truly astonishing.
It is
if
incredible.
They all, in a way, they purchased that. When you tune into the Super Bowl, you don't have to spend, and I would presume books were not cheap.
Oh no.
Back then.
They were getting cheaper, especially pamphlets, and I believe that was around the time of the paperback book. I don't remember exactly. But they were definitely getting cheaper, but it was still an expensive endeavor to some degree. And most people would have to go to libraries to get that, so there's probably more people who read it than actually bought it.
Mm-hmm. And this points to an interesting notion that he highlights in the book, and it's that in colonial America especially, the population was surprisingly literate, and not only that wasn't reserved for the upper class, that was across the board in society. Like,
yeah, you would think that with there's a famous quote that I forget who said it, but it goes along the lines of, "You wouldn't be surprised to find a colonial American carrying a book along with his plow." And that is to say that compared with places like Europe, which they had avid readers, of course, they had significantly less, which is a really interesting phenomenon, especially when compared that the United States at that time was a field, effectively, and it was just growing into a new thing.
Yeah, it could tell you a lot about the type of people that would have made that decision to migrate and the values they would have instilled in their posterity.
Yeah, he talks about how the British, I suppose at that point, coming over, brought with them an entire country's heritage of writing, which would have been, 300 years old? Math. But a lot of written language already, so that they came over. It really wasn't until the 1800s probably that you had genuine American writers.
Yeah.
I can never place when all the different people are, but like Ralph Waldo Emerson will not come until quite a while later, because he's a penultimate American writer. If you don't know who he is, read his work. It's hard, but read it.
And not only was it not reserved for the upper classes, it wasn't strictly reserved to men either, which is something that was really fascinating, especially at this time, since you would normally obviously associate, like, men were the ones who were being who it was seen as important to be educated.
Yeah, at the time it was obviously the clear separation in sexes. Yeah, and Postman uses a really interesting, I think I'm figuring out what you're alluding to. He uses the statistic of it would have been very likely on an American farm that the woman would have been more educated, actually, because she spends more time at home. Well, she does a lot more than the man typically does. She spends more time in one spot where you would read a book.
And education at this time, too, was much more valued than it was in other parts of the world.
Reading, writing, arithmetic. Yeah, definitely. America was really the first nation to have a genuine social and governmental interest in creating educational systems. Because when the Americans came over, or again, the British came over, the Europeans, dang it, in Britain still, it was mostly private schools that were, if you had wealth, you would send your student to school.
Yeah.
And in the Americas, it was the same way for quite a while, but the mid-1800s, you do have that shift in sooner than most other countries into
it's
public
seen
education.
It's seen as essential that the masses are educated, and even in the religious sense, it was seen as, I forget the quote, but like, education was the way to ward off the devil. It was like it was much harder for the devil to tempt an educated individual than an ignorant individual.
Yeah, well, when you have the Puritans coming over with their beliefs of the Bible is the Word of God, the Protestant belief that Luther always imposed, or suggested at least, was that the book was all you needed. You didn't necessarily need a church, although they almost always created some institution. The book was what you needed to understand God, and that's why, starting with the printing press and Luther, so many people became much more literate, because they needed to be able to read the Word of God itself and educate themselves in that. And when you have the Puritans and the Protestants coming over, and that's such a fundamental belief of their religion, it makes complete sense that would happen.
And these writers and authors and great that's the word, right?
Yeah, orator.
Orators.
There you go.
Were, in a way, they were like the pop icons of their time. Like, the masses really, like, one, bought their works, and two, flocked to their lectures in large numbers, which...
Back in the 1800s, he uses the example of the Lincoln and Douglas debates in 1860, I believe it is, or 1858, right before the Civil War, effectively. And he talks about how them, in addition to people, I forget his name, but other famous writers and lecturers would tour the country and give presentations to effectively carnivals, like carnival groups, where they'd be in a tent and like give like a 7-hour speech.
Yeah.
And then the other person would get 7 hours in rebuttal.
Yeah.
To the point
Lincoln.
he talks about, there's a famous story where Lincoln suggested that the audience go home, have dinner, and come back to hear like the
4 more hours.
Yeah, the final rebuttals.
Like, you could never imagine that today. When you have a presidential debate on television,
They get what, 60 seconds?
they get 60 seconds, and then if someone's name is mentioned, they get like 20 seconds to respond or something crazy like that. These went on for hours between two people, and now we have, like, in certain presidential primaries, you have an hour and a half to get through
all of the
like
topics.
10 people across a number of different topics, and that it really shows you how the medium can almost cripple any chance of any information getting out to anyone, to the point where these debates turn into like schoolyard like roast sessions.
They
or
really
something.
do. They really do. And don't be mistaken here. Lincoln and Douglas, they roasted each other. Oh yeah. If you don't know the famous story of Sumter and the other guy's name, on the Senate floor when one of the senators beat another because he effectively roasted his state. And it's a horrifying but brilliant story, and it shows a really great example of, like, yeah, we were always roast bosses. And I think it's important to point out here that while this is really incredibly impressive that they had these really long debates, or rather discussions,
there was still passion behind them.
Well, there was that, and most of their stuff was written.
Mm-hmm.
Most of their initial speeches were written, and they planned the rebuttals in writing.
Yeah.
So this ties neatly to the notion of, in the 18th century, there only was typographic discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And oratory that existed was typographical oratory, in that they were reading speeches.
It all complemented one another, as opposed to television and social media that actively discourage people from pursuing those, from reading.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why when you read a speech from Lincoln or Douglas or any of those mid-century people, what they're talking about, even if it was impromptu, it sounds like a paragraph form. Yeah. Because it is. Everything they did, newspapers, penny newspapers, writing, information, anything that was important really was transversed in writing, including advertising, which was actually done in paragraph form, which there is...
We'll get to that.
Yes.
We can get to that later.
And you can see why this book is so... You can already see why it's so influential in that it gets to the crux of everything, on every notion.
I think what you were saying about how they would still throw insults, they would in some cases assault each other, but I think it speaks to this wasn't stuck up intellectuals just talking about like these subjects that didn't affect anyone, or these highly abstract concepts. These were things that people were passionate about, and things that the masses were passionate about. But it was still done because of the benefits of typography in such an intellectual manner.
Yeah, Postman writes, he had a really poignant paragraph that I found really interesting, in that he basically put you in the shoes of a 19th century listener going to one of those debates. You would have to comprehend these massive hyphenated semicolon sentences with extremely intellectual thought process and word choice and grammar and syntax and all that, in addition to having a incredible context that you already know about. While people today may know some things about the major issues,
there's less understanding.
Yes, people in the 1860s would know about many things, but the nuances of many things. In fact, Postman put out certain things that I didn't even recognize and had never heard of as context for those people. Which just goes to say that because writing was all they had, and that style was what dictated the way they thought and discussed, it really shifts and kind of... I just lost the sentence. Why does this always happen when I have a really good sentence?
I'll keep going.
Go ahead.
I'll keep going, and if you can,
I'll shout.
You can interject if you remember. And in a way, these long-form discussions, debates were seen as essential for everyone, just in much the same way as education was. It was essential to understand these complex ideas so that you were I guess you could say an educated voter. We talk a lot about, in today's society, needing to be an educated voter, and it's your constitutional duty to know the issues. But by these standards that were set in a typographic age, I'd say almost no one is an educated voter.
Yeah, the best way to put this is these people didn't know of things, they knew about them. While people today know of the presidential candidates and like their histories and all the different politics around them, people of the 1860s would have known about them, everything they had done, all their different things, where they come from, what books they had written. Although, interestingly, they probably would not have known what they looked like.
Yeah.
Postman points out that most citizens would not have recognized the first, I think he says, 15 or 16 presidents.
Had they passed them on the street.
Right, because this was first of all, it was an era before photography, so the only thing they had was effectively painting, and you don't see very many paintings of individuals in the United States, especially at that time. And this ties neatly into the next subject, which you can stop me if I'm going too quickly here to shift, in that in the 1860s, it was the word and the written word that was important, but as it shifted to the age of television, it was about
image.
Image, yes.
Image presentation. It was much less. It became much less about your ideas and more about what you look like, how you presented your ideas, the medium you used, the language you used, and it was.
And such is
the message became almost irrelevant.
Yeah, and such is exactly what Postman is arguing is incredibly dangerous to social discourse to exist with that. And to elaborate on that, like you alluded to earlier with the presidential debates, where they get 60 seconds and then maybe 20 to respond to the opponent that said something about them, that it's no longer about how much about the citations and the relevance and the correctness of what they say. Rather, it's about the way they carry themselves and how they say it, the inflection, if you will. I have a joke, but I'm not allowed to say it. Luke will hit me in the face if I do. But you know the one.
No, I don't. Now you have to say it.
No. But now with these new debates, it's just about how you carry themselves. Postman uses the example of when Ronald Reagan was in one of his debates. He used a single zinger upon being charged at his old age, because he was the oldest president at 70, I believe, 69, one of the two. And famously in the newspapers the next day, because of that zinger, it said Reagan had won the debate, even though no debate had really happened. It was more of just zingers firing back and forth.
Yeah.
Zingers of who could be the most witty or who be the most impressive. And it's not a surprise, as Postman points out, that in the beginning of the age of television, that an actor became president. Regardless of his philosophies and what Reagan did as a president and his policies. It was a roundabout sentence. But
the fact that he originated from show business
gave him a high air. In fact, he's often attributed the quote, "Politics is just show business," which it is. He's very much right.
And this has reached almost a distracting level today. It's no coincidence who our president is. I mean, you can say what you will about politics, but it's quite obvious why a business tycoon with a television show and who used essentially memes to ascend to the presidency.
Yeah, again, regardless of policy, and we're not arguing any direction here, just to enforce that, but it's not a surprise that all of the presidents have been that way. I believe it was the campaign advisor of Richard Nixon when he was running. After he had retired, there's a book he wrote called "Selling the President," which is about exactly what it sounds like, in that it was selling the president as a product, not as an intellectual or as someone who would do things necessarily, but as someone who would look good on TV, have a firm handshake, and would have a good smile.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Nixon, because infamously, in his debate, the first ever televised debate, him and Kennedy, right?
I don't know my presidential candidates. I don't know them.
I think, but his opponent looked so much cleaner and was so much better prepared for the camera that regardless of what was said, it was a given that Nixon lost.
At least that debate in the initial account.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. When we're based entirely on a society of images rather than words, it's no wonder that that's what we find appealing.
Mm-hmm.
The best example of this, and so Postman makes the important distinction in the use of the word epistemology or epistemology. How I don't really know how to say it. Neither of us can really figure it out. It's kind of a weird word. I think it's epistemology, but you pretend
That's what the audiobook said.
Right, so we'll go with that. But he argues that epistemology is, again, the way people are thinking about knowledge and what it means to be knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm.
And there's several things intertwined in that.
That's a good one. I've got something on that.
Yeah, but the one thing he points out is the way people think. So in the age of Enlightenment, with the Lincoln Douglas debates again, like we talked about, they were thinking in sentence and complex paragraph form. When compared to today, if I were to say Albert Einstein, what is the first thing you think of him?
An image of an old man.
And Postman points out, kind of freakily, he's like, it was an image, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was. And you think of the image first, and then you think about what he did. And I suppose if you're a well-acclaimed scientist and you know a lot about him, you probably might think about his work sooner. But for the general mass, that's what we see first, because it's the most receptive and most associated thing within the epistemology of our society and how we think.
And that's true with almost any public figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes back to how the media influences our very definition of what is considered intelligent, because during the age of oratory, before the before the written word was widely disseminated, your intellect might be assessed on how eloquently you spoke, or like the complexity of the words you used, how effective of a speaker you are, how you came across to an audience. And I clearly wouldn't be considered very intelligent.
Oh, you're doing a great job.
But as the written word took more of a hold with the invention of the printing press, it became much more about the contents of what you said, and that then sort of retroactively applied those same standards to oratory, in that it once again became centered about what you said. Mm-hmm. And as we've gone more towards television and social media and the internet, it's increasingly become intelligence has almost been defined by the amount of stuff you know, like useless trivia.
Certainly,
memorization is certainly a big one that's stressed. I mean, just look at the first 5 years of elementary school.
Well, there's a debate to be had there within elementary school, especially elementary school, but I would definitely agree that within public education itself, it's very much an endless game of trivial pursuit, in that it's just how many things can you memorize, because yes, some of those things are relevant and important, like you should know about United States history, you should know world history, and you should be able to do math and speak eloquently to some degree, but a lot of that is pretty useless. I mean, look at trigonometry. Most high schools will never see a triangle without the other the other leg, that stuff. And that's, I mean, for me, it's the point where I take it upon myself to find other avenues in that, and I find like, okay, I think more about not necessarily the content, but about why the content is what it is, if that makes sense. In that I'm thinking about my thinking to really prepare myself to think on not a higher plane. It's a really difficult concept to explain. I'd like to flesh it out some other time, but we do not have time for this with this book. We have more pages to go through.
And I'm jumping ahead a little, but as the book puts it, thinking on a subject is not something that's entertaining, and therefore it doesn't play well on television, and my guess is it doesn't play well here either. Us stuttering over sentences because we can't quite think of the right word isn't is only entertaining in that, haha, these people are fumbling over their words.
Well, if we hold a sentence for 6 seconds, you probably paused it thinking we broke down.
Yeah.
And that is just an element of awareness and attentiveness. I believe the average attentive time he cites is 45 seconds, which I think is unbelievably high.
Yeah.
I would argue more around 6 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 10 at most. And that's something I struggle with, like we talked about earlier,
Absolutely.
is getting through some of these paragraphs that are 5 minutes long.
Yeah.
You'd have to pause in between, 1, to understand the content, and 2, just to make sure you're paying attention. I'd find myself slowly drifting away, thinking about the things I have to do for this podcast that I hadn't prepared yet. And there's other elements to that, but a large part of it is that impatience and the short attention span.
Mm-hmm.
And this attention span, I feel, leads us right into the next topic of the now-this conundrum.
Ooh.
Now,
Are we skipping ahead?
I don't really know. I don't really know where we are. I think we're in order. So,
Yeah.
Postman uses the phrase now, and a little ellipse, which is the 3 dots, this. So, like, now, this, that kind of thing. And you've probably heard that a number of times on television, in that, like, some event is broadcasted, they say now this, and then something else. And maybe talk about it, maybe show some video and tell you about it.
Yeah.
And
go
ahead.
What I found interesting was he kind of described now this as the opposite of a conjunction, in that you were just about to say that. Sorry. In that a conjunction combines 2 ideas, but now this implies that there's absolutely no correlation between the thing you heard prior and the thing you are about to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the best example of this is just honestly put on any kind of news station, and you'll see, on an extreme example of, like, mass shootings, now this, new school plans, now this, presidential debates. They're all unrelated and don't have context that connects them to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to just being short and forcing you to have a short attention span, what this really does that's dangerous is desensitizes you to important information.
Yeah, it tells you that nothing is really important enough that you think about it for more than 45 seconds, which is the statistic he cites as the average length of time for a news story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says the best entertainment and the best advertising particularly is something that doesn't make you think or be perplexed in any way. Because if you have to think or you're perplexed, you have to look at another source and spend more time on it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start doing that, you're already 3, now this is behind.
Yeah, that prevents you from, therefore, consuming the next piece of content that they want to shove down your throat.
And because the goal of this isn't to keep you educated, per se, or even, I'd really even say informed, as it is to keep you entertained.
Yes.
Amused, if you will, to death.
And that is the real crux of this entire work here.
And this isn't meant to say that there's this government lizard man conspiracy that the media is trying to desensitize us and give us short attention spans. This is, as Postman argues, the natural result of the television's epistemology, in that it's forcing us to have short attention spans, be pictorial based, and be contextless, really.
Yeah, it's inevitable, and we're jumping ahead again, but to put it in terms of the 2 great novels, 1984 by George Orwell and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
I read both. I'm partying over here.
Yeah, hopefully we will do an episode
we should do one
on those 2 someday.
I'll write it down.
But in 1984, Orwell argues through the story that a big brother type figure will be needed to suppress the masses, control information, spread disinformation, remove history, and it's terrifying the way he presents it.
Yeah, effectively, 1984 is saying that we will see this happen in that it'll be not necessarily a destructive event, but will be in the novel. The main character Winston Smith, he knows about all this stuff, but he doesn't do anything because he'll be shot, or rather removed. Is the what is it? Annihilated? Vaporized. That's the word. In that he entirely removed from history is what they're arguing there. However,
that novel was largely in response to authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, but as we have moved from that, and the world has largely moved away from those such regimes, we've now seen that there is no authoritarian regime or dictatorship or big brother that's necessary to stop the public from receiving the information.
Well, Orwell's best example is his story came true in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
In the time of particularly Stalin, a little bit of Khrushchev, but particularly Stalin mostly, because honestly that's when it was written about him.
Yeah.
That's why
Really.
Big Brother looks like Stalin in the book. But as the Soviet Union has fallen apart and turned into several democratic countries, the only things we're left with is like Cuba and North Korea, but even they aren't really still this complete totalitarian countries. They are still pretty open by comparison, and don't have a complete restriction of thought.
So what Aldous Huxley argues in Brave New World is that there will be such an abundance of irrelevant information in the form of entertainment and pleasure that no one will really care to know the truth. No one will care about information, and there will be no need to ban a book or do any of these things.
Yeah, in the book,
I actually think I think I should read the opening.
I haven't read it. I didn't read the preface.
You didn't read not the preface, but the foreword. Forward.
Yeah. If you sure read it, enlighten me.
Keep talking. I have to figure out where to start here.
Okay, so the best way to compare the two, Brave New World in 1984. In 1984, it's the discussion of a totalitarian government taking control of everything, and we can see that, and we kind of accept it because we can't do anything about it. This is what's called doublethink in the book, in that we recognize this is a horrible thing to do, but yet it works, so we're here.
Yeah.
It takes the entire book to understand it. I barely understand doublethink as it is. But then on the other hand, Aldous Huxley argues in Brave New World that because there's so much entertainment, we're so desensitized to information that we don't care anymore. And this is basically best shown in that throughout the book there's a miracle drug, which you can compare to, I guess, cocaine of Soma, maybe LSD. But it's called Soma. And
here it's compared to television.
Right, in that Soma, if someone is stressed or thinking too much about like things that are going out of hand, everyone in the society tells them have some Soma. Because it just gets rid of it.
And there are so many things in modern society that you could compare that to.
Absolutely. And he poignantly and excellently conveys it to television in that when we're scared of the world, go to television.
Television, social media, even though that's sometimes creates more stress. Pornography, things of that nature.
Short-term gains that you can use to feel better about yourself when you can't really do anything.
I will now read the foreword of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. We were keeping our eye on 1984. When the year came and the prophecy didn't, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we, at least, had not been visited by Orwellian nightmares. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly less well-known, equally chilling, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesize the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression, but in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared was those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who would want to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy,
Yeah.
and the centrifugal bumble puppy. Was that in the book?
I don't remember that at all. I'm gonna have to go back and find that. That sounds interesting.
Anyway, to continue. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account men's almost indefinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, "People are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure." In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. And he goes on to say, this book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. And I'd say he did a pretty damn good job of that.
I would definitely agree. I think when associated with Huxley, and excellent reading by the way, when associated with Huxley, the word irrelevance I find particularly interesting.
Did you just pronounce it irrelevance?
I'm sorry. I was hoping you wouldn't notice. Irrelevance. There we go. Anyways, I find it really interesting because this, I think, is best understood in the way we think about history. So, for many people, history is knowing about who's on the dollar bill and who's been in government maybe the past 20 years or so, maybe that much. And
memorization.
And the fact,
checking the box.
Exactly. And the fact that the American Revolution did in fact happen. Things like that. Simple, memorizable checklist facts. While instead, what we're ignoring is the themes over time and how they're changing. In other words, we're looking at history as a fun story and as irrelevant to modern day as a function. And that's something I truly fear as
absolutely
the statement's always used, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, but I always like to amend that to the phrase, those who know history are doomed to stand by the sidelines and watch those who don't repeat it. Because in a world where most of the world ignores the themes of history and like what happened and recognizing like why we don't do certain things anymore, those are the people that will definitely repeat it, and those of us who see that can't change that.
As Postman puts later in the book, there was once a time when government tyranny was the primary threat to liberal democracy and the freedom of thought. But he argues that today, or at the time of writing the book, the fight against censorship is largely irrelevant because, yes, it's annoying when a book gets banned, but what's going to affect an impressionable child more? Having a book that they can't read in one part of the country, or being so attached to television and the internet and social media that he would never want to pick up a book in the first place.
Exactly. He uses the example of Sesame Street multiple times in the education chapter to discuss how Sesame Street initially was designed as a way to make education fun and entertaining. Keyword there. However, as it's grown and as the style of teaching demonstrated in Sesame Street has grown, it has expanded into modern education in that we watch movies, we watch YouTube videos, we do
Bill Nye the Science Guy is not an accident.
Right, and you could even tie this to, like, we do more experiments in science, which is a little more of a stretch, but it's still the idea of having a pictorial image of that to educate you. And even though Bill Nye only has, I think, 1 or 2 degrees, he's a renowned reverend figure for a lot of children as a source of knowledge and intellect.
And it's not the problem that you're teaching things to people in this way. It's that then sets the precedent that anything they learn should come ideally in the form of entertainment. It should not be boring. It should not be difficult. It should be fun in a way. And that's, I think, a dangerous precedent to set, because I don't think learning and education should be deprived of difficulty. I think because when you think about it, it really is delayed gratification. You are learning this in the present because it will be valuable to you later. And not just the content you're learning. He talks about this a lot, about how education is equally about learning how to learn.
Exactly.
Learning how to critically think. And there will be an episode on education someday.
That'll be a fun one.
Hopefully with a guest. But
I don't know if we can afford him. Our budget's like 3 cents.
Donate to Patreon?
No. We don't have. We can make that if you'd like, guys. But yeah, certainly it's using the use of television is changing how we expect to learn. And the principal notion that he argues throughout the book is that television is not bad in and of itself, but the way its epistemology is fundamentally challenging of typography and oratory to the point that it utterly destroys it. For example, and there's no way that television can survive along with typography and not hurt each other. He uses the example, several satirical examples of like a PhD student using the TV to light up his homework, a book, or like a granny putting books on the TV. And it's like he argues that like that all of these examples of how TV will help propel the book further is either menial or unhelpful, if not destructive to it itself.
Yeah. I think what we really haven't touched on is, maybe a little, but the idea of news programs as, well, we have sort of in Now This. But do you think we have much more? Like, we talked a little about how they have to be attractive. They have to, he uses the analogy as you're not assembling a team of newscasters, you're assembling a team of talking hairdos, because everyone must be attractive, everyone must look fit, everyone must be engaging, energetic, because fundamentally modern news is entertainment, and that's its goal, not to inform, to entertain.
Best summarized, the whole second part of the book is just chapter after chapter of demonstrating how different fields of thought, particularly religion, politics, and education, have become not facets of being the best theologian, being the smartest political theorist, or being the best educator, but being the best entertainer for every single one of them, which is harming that, in that we expect to be entertained in every way. And while, yes, I would argue that especially education doesn't have to be dull and boring, it can be fun, but Postman poignantly points out that you can't do that with something like religion. The whole purpose of a religion is to have... he compares the words entertainment and... what's the other one? Effectively awe in comparison. In that he's saying the institutions of religion are not there to entertain you. So like the fancy cloaks priests wear, or the fancy churches, or the stained glasses, or the use of old languages, they're not there to entertain you, but rather awe you into believing further, if that makes sense. And he argues that a religion without sacredness of space can't exist.
Yes.
And be religion in its fullest form, because you obviously can make a sanctuary or a mosque, I suppose. You can make those holy places, but you can't make a TV station sacred when before, after, and sometimes in the middle there's ads. What would you do? What would you do if your priest was standing there on the altar and turn around? Okay, I'd like to thank Dollar Shave Club for today's like it turns into a joke, right?
Yeah.
And
but that's what's happened with news, and that's what's happened with these televangelists.
Absolutely. At the time of writing, the televangelists were much more popular than they are now, obviously. But I still feel this connects very much to today and how we do things, particularly on social media.
I was going to use this as a jumping off point for how the virtual services during the pandemic, when I would wake up for church, I would get dressed in a very respectable outfit and go to church and be in a space ready to do worship. But when it's on a television screen, or even worse, on your phone, then the family wasn't taking it seriously up there. We were eating breakfast while watching church.
Right.
And we were in our whatever we happened to wake up in, and it's something's lost there, and that's definitely true as much so for education. I started college classes last week, and it's sort of a hybrid format where some days I go into school and some days I attend via Zoom, and I can clearly say that, and this might be somewhat my fault, but it's a lot harder to learn over the virtual format. I would use the example that, I'm going to embarrass myself here, but my class started at 10. I got back from a run at 9:50, and during my statistics class, I made myself a smoothie.
Exactly. Yeah. I was trying to find the passage in here where it was a really good passage I wanted to find here, but Postman argues basically what you're saying is like, in the same way that
I can keep talking if you
go,
need to find some.
Keep talking.
I would, not to throw my brother under the bus, but he struggled just as much in the spring to the point where he almost failed some classes because of the online format, and it sort of speaks to how people aren't really self-motivated anymore. Would you say?
Yeah, I would. Well, yeah, that's a whole separate issue.
They're only there to check the box.
Absolutely.
And with no one there to make them check the box, they don't check the box.
Absolutely. I found the passage here.
Awesome.
Regarding.
I was running out of stuff.
Regarding sacredness of space and just how you revere that, and how we don't realize how much our location affects how we think. So I'm gonna have to kind of crop as I go, but Postman is talking about how even in times of necessary need, he writes, almost any place will do provided it can be decontaminated, that is, divested of profane uses. This can be done by placing a cross on the wall, or candles on a table, or a sacred document in public view. Through such acts, a gymnasium or dining hall or hotel room can be transformed into a place of worship. And here is the key part. A slice of space-time can be removed from the world of profane events and be recreated into a reality that does not belong to our world. So here he's arguing that by making a space sacred, when you're in there in the flesh and in the present, you feel that sacredness in your, for lack of a better word, you're compelled to follow the decorum of that room. He goes on to write, when it's something like you're in your home and you're watching it on TV, he writes, the activities in one's living room or bedroom, or God help us, one's kitchen, are usually the same whether a religious program is being presented or the A-Team or Dallas is being presented, which are obviously both two TV shows. People will eat, talk, go to the bathroom, do push-ups, or any of the things they were accustomed to doing in the presence of an animated television screen. If the audience is not immersed in the aura of mystery and symbolic otherworldliness, then it is unlikely that it will call forth the state of mind required for non-trivial religious experience. And the key word that I feel is non-trivial.
Non-trivial.
In that it's, like you were saying, you made a smoothie because it's not worth your attention.
Yeah.
And when it's a screen compared to a live person, it's not at all the same there because the medium is affecting what's coming through it. Mm-hmm. Even if they're speaking through the TV.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly affects, at least with the example he uses as the TV evangelists, about how unlike a normal preacher, these preachers preached that comfort was achievable through religion, and wealth was achievable through religion, and even virtuous through religion. Which he cites it's easier for a camel to enter the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter heaven. But in the case of these TV preachers, they have to conform their message to the widest possible audience, being a television audience. And a television audience is very much expecting what they see in other entertainment.
Absolutely, yeah. When you go to the TV...
Consumerism, commercialism.
Exactly. When you go to the TV, most people aren't expecting to be... Well, I would say no person is expecting to be educated. They're expecting to be entertained. Amused, if you want. I need to stop that. But, I mean, look no further than the History Channel. Mm-hmm. What's now famously called the History Channel effect, in that what used to be a really great source of educational documentaries with a pretty high budget for doing some really good stuff, because they made more money doing things like Ghost Hunters and Pawn Stars and American Pickers. It's no wonder those shows are all that's on now. If I see a documentary, it's always some like aliens and Hitler invaded Egypt, that kind of thing. It's and even those are entertainment, not educational, although some people might call them the best kind of educainment.
Education. Need to write a book. You could make a religion out of it.
No, don't.
I love the idea that people have no idea what we're talking about.
Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yes.
Nonetheless, the whole point of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and to kind of wrap up here, unless you have any major things you want to cover. Did you?
We didn't. Did we talk about advertisements?
Oh, we didn't.
We didn't really. We alluded to it a few times.
Well, we gotta go back now. I was gonna do like a nice little neat wrap up. No, we're not. We are not wrapping up. So, advertisements, as all of you should know, the point of them is to get you to buy or do something. In other words, compel you to have or want something. In that advertisement, that's the definition of an advertisement. So, he uses the example of, I believe it's Paul Revere.
Are you trying to juxtapose the paragraph format that advertisements used to be, about how it was all about the product and how it was about convincing people that it was the most effective thing rather than portraying some sort of image?
Yes, I am. I'm again trying to find things because he just writes it so well.
Making me talk.
I'm sorry.
Because remember, it's not entertaining to listen to people think.
It's almost like there's some kind of illusion going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never find it in the time. But he makes a juxtaposition really well that these 18th century Americans, he provides per word an ad from a newspaper at the time, one of the first ads to actually appear in a newspaper, and it was entirely a 8 or 9 sentence paragraph of complex language describing a plot of land and how much it cost and like the animals on it and what to do if you wanted to buy it. There were no images. There was no imagery in the writing form of imagery. It was entirely a written statement of an advertisement. And there was no appeal to emotion. It was entirely an appeal to reason in that it argued like things to the effect of, this is why you should, like, this land is of great quality. There's a nice farmhouse on it. There's a number of servants. We'll go with that. But later in the book, he, in a chapter more dedicated to advertising, he describes how advertising is not about logic anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's entirely about emotion.
I'm going to pull up an example here.
Oh, excellent. And this can, I mean, we talked briefly about the presidential debates earlier and, quote, selling the president, in that it's not about appealing to why you want to have that president, but appealing to why they look good and showing you what they look like. I would have been very surprised if our largest, I believe it's Tubman, who was incredibly fat. Taft, that's right. Not Harriet Tubman. She was a woman. But Taft was famously an incredibly overweight president, breaking his bathtub on numerous occasions and having his own commissioned. There is no chance in the world that he would have ever been elected today.
Oh, absolutely not.
Because solely of his looks. While at the time, first of all, people probably wouldn't have known what he looked like, and if they did, it would have only been from a political cartoon, which would have been further exaggerated, horrifying. Gosh.
It's frightening.
How much do you need to exaggerate? I mean, it's pretty there already.
Point across.
Did you find?
I was going to try and find that the commercial for the cat food that goes like meow 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 meow. Just to use that as an example.
I loved. Please explain the relevance here. I want to know now.
Well, that commercial is not talking about how great the cat food is for your cat or anything of that nature. If it does, no one remembers that. Yeah. It has a catchy jingle with a cat synthesizer.
It's no wonder that all news channels have music underneath it to tell you what.
We didn't.
And there's so much we didn't get to.
Go.
So on news channels, next time you listen for music. It is almost always at the beginning and the end, if not all the time. Mm-hmm. And the point of music in film and live television is to tell you what...
Set the mood.
Right, to tell you what emotion you should be feeling. Most often, the only times that are reserved to not having any music at all on channels that normally do are like presidential assassinations and major events. Yeah. Even those are trivialized, but you know.
If you turned on the news and it cut immediately to just someone speaking, you would be incredibly alarmed. Without music, without fancy graphics.
Certainly.
And, like, the best example I can kind of come up with of this is the tornado alarm that they play on television.
It's complete silence except for the speaker. Yeah. At least in the Midwest, where we all just go watch the storm instead.
And I'm sure there's things that...
You just got up. There you go. I figured it out.
I'm sure there's things that, if we treated with that same level of reverence, would be considered just as scary, but that's not entertainment. That doesn't make the person want to keep watching or come back tomorrow.
Yeah, well, tying back to earlier, I used the example of the now this, each of the different 3 things happening one after the other, one in which I exaggerated as like a mass murder. A lot that happens decently often, or some major disaster happens probably every 3 or 4 months, and all of those, there's probably an extra 50 seconds added to that announcement, but any following ones are always just as short and followed by other nonsense that is completely not contextually related. And if it is,
all bookended by music and periodically interrupted by commercials.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the real issue you face when you try to educate yourself through news medias, is that so much of it is irrelevant and unhelpful to you and pointless of, quote, being informed. For example, if being informed means knowing what's going on and just keeping track of the government, I would like to ask you, who is the Secretary General? Or Secretary of State?
That one's overused.
Well, it's an example in the book.
Yeah.
I would have said Postmaster General, but he's only notable because there's some stuff going on right now. But other people like that, you don't know who those are. I can guarantee you don't.
But I guarantee you have an opinion on whether it should or shouldn't be the person it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Regardless of whether you know anything about them.
Furthermore, Postman argues that things like when you educate yourself on like the conflict in the Middle East or like different incidents in the country, what are you going to do right now that will affect it in a positive way? Most people would answer vote, but voting is voting for one person, maybe 4, I guess, that might uphold what they're saying they will and might have the same ideas as you. And if they do, they probably aren't elected.
And in more cases, you're voting for a party, not a person.
In most cases, you're voting for a party with a pretty person instead of a party with an idea. See, it all comes together. This is why this book is so phenomenal, in that it all ties together so wonderfully in like just dense meat. Or if you're a vegetarian, dense tofu.
Soy.
So what now? Have we missed anything? We'll probably miss something.
Probably. We will more than.
This is our longest episode yet.
More than definitely have to add a follow-up to the next episode, which will be next week at the same time.
Yes.
Good.
And we'll figure out that topic probably after this.
Yeah.
But just to wrap up this whole discussion, Luke and I incredibly recommend you read this novel. Is it a novel? Novel? What does it count as?
I don't know. I guess it's
just a book.
I wanted to keep writing novel, especially in my description. But...
Yeah. Nonetheless, we incredibly suggest you read it. Take it a chapter at a time. Don't do what we did and try and reread the whole book in a week. Or if you're like me, mostly today. But that's why we pushed back, because I was a little behind. But this book, the whole point of it is that while television itself isn't a bad thing and entertainment isn't an issue, you need to be aware as citizens and as members of a society of how the medium affects what you think and what you see. And this does apply both to books and speeches and radio and podcasts even. Yeah. Although our word is God, so I mean, don't challenge it at all. Obviously. But as particularly television, because of the way it's developed over the past years. And Luke, can you tell us when this book was written?
This book was written in 1985. That's 35 years ago.
Incredibly still relevant.
More than even when it was written, because essentially the last 30 years of history have just been proving this book to be correct in its predictions.
Yeah, he was correct in his time, and it's, like you said, just been keeps compounding frighteningly in favor of him. And I don't like to agree with him, but I certainly do, because he's right, and his argument is very compelling. There are some holes in it, and if you can figure those out, I challenge our listeners to read the book and find those. Yeah. Because if you can, that is an excellent.
Be critical of any media you consume in any form.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about why we assume books are truth.
Yeah.
Or why even sometimes television is truth, but again, it's really best just to read it. He puts it so much more concisely than we ever will, probably. And it's a short book, and it will give you nice big words to work with.
Yeah. I believe this is where we end today's episode.
I think so.
So, I will request that if you are still listening and have enjoyed, you subscribe if you are not already.
If you do, I'll give you a high five.
If we know you.
I'm not adding that clause. This is a non-conditional. Just if you do, I will.
Okay.
Don't worry about the how. Just worry about the I will.
We need to end this. We're taking up too much.
Anyway.
We're taking up too much of these people's time. I am Luke.
And I am Andrew.
And this has been the Two Existential Dudes podcast. Thank you for listening.